أعزائي المشاهدين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أسعد الله أوقاتكم بكل خير. نرحب بكم في حلقة جديدة من برنامج الحد الأدنى. يسعدنا في هذا المساء أن نفتح آفاق جديدة للحوار مع الدكتور رولان مارشال. الدكتور مارشال أستاذ العلوم السياسية واختصاصي في السياسات الافريقية، وهو عضو فاعل وباحث في المركز القومي للدراسات والبحوث العلمية في باريس. ظل متخصصا في القضايا الافريقية منذ وقت طويل، وهو من ابرز اختصاصيي السياسة الافريقية في فرنسا وفي اوروبا كذلك. نستضيفه اليوم لنواصل الحوار حول آفاق العلاقات الفرنسية الافريقية وكذلك قضايا القارة، لا سيما وهو لديه اهتمامات خاصة وبحوث خاصة حول منطقة القرن الافريقي، وهو ايضا متخصص في السودان، حيث ظل يزور السودان منذ العام 1986، واليوم يزور السودان ضمن جهوده البحثية والعلمية في الإقليم وفي السودان. Mr. Roland Marshall, welcome to Sudan first and welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Dr. Marshall, you are a specialist in political science and conflict in Africa, and also you have a real deep research and deliberation on sub-Saharan Africa and conflict resolution. We are really glad and delighted to conduct this interview with you to shed some lights on the development in the region and also to touch upon the French-African relation as well. My first question will be that France foreign policy in Africa. After the election of President Hollande, some specialists witnessed a real change in the discourse and try to distance the French from the French legacy in Africa. Do you think there is a new perspective on Africa under Roland, under the presidency of Mr. Macron right now?
Well, it's too early to say. What we can say with certainty is that Africa has changed dramatically over the last 50 years, and therefore the expectations from African youth, African politicians, African states toward France has evolved as well. Now, on the French side, I think Emmanuel Macron, our new president, made clear at one point that he is born after the independence of most African countries, so therefore it will be very difficult to link him to the history of colonization and or the early stage of the relations.
So a real departure from the French legacy
is what is stated. I believe personally that it's on one side it was already nearly true for François Hollande, the previous president. And what we have to see, I'm a political scientist, so therefore I have to pay attention to discourses, to speeches made by officials, but as well I will have to take into account what are the practices of the French state, or the policies of the actual policies, not what is told to the public, are actually changing. What we see for the time being is basically President Macron is somewhat prisoner of problems that existed prior his election. He has a crisis in Sahel. He has the future of the Operation Barkhane, a French military force that is supposed to fight jihadi movement in the Sahel. He has the crisis linked to migrations from Africa to Europe.
Fighting terrorism as well.
On fighting terrorism, which is part of Sahel and Barkhane agenda. As well, he will have certainly to deal with a very difficult issue, which is not so discussed, I guess, in Sudan, is the issue of the currency, the franc CFA. The franc CFA is a currency that is deeply connected to the French currency, and then today to the euro. But of course, a number of African partners would like to have a greater say in the management of the currency, in its exchange rate and so on, because for the time being, dealing with franc CFA is like dealing with euro. So it brings some advantages because it's very stable, it's a very strong currency, but as well, if you want to export, you need to be competitive, and in this case, it's too expensive. So you have a number of issues that are now on the table. We will see whether the new president will be able to address them in an innovative manner. And as well, we will see how he will maybe take on board a number of issues for the next future.
We think that there is a new and fresh perspective when we see that President Macron visited Anglophone countries for the first time, maybe, and as if he's shifting from the old zones of Francophone to Anglophone, not really connected to that history. What do you think about that?
No, I don't believe that this is really. If you look back, what has been happening, France has a strategic cooperation commission with South Africa for nearly more than 2 decades. If you look the countries, France is an important investor. You will have to quote, let's say, Nigeria, which doesn't speak especially French, for what I know. You will have to talk about Angola, doesn't speak French as a former colony. It's not. You will talk about Kenya, for instance. France is the 5th investor in Kenya. Kenya is not a former French colony and doesn't speak French. So the idea that a French president will travel in Anglophone countries in Africa is not new. It happened.
It's quite normal.
I could say that. Of course, the attention is what we have to differentiate between the policy of a state and then the attitude of French firms. What we see is French firms are already present in most of Africa, where they can make money.
But Dr. Marshall, I think France is only using military power, and it is Francophone zones for security. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, France has a very specific constitution that allows the president to order troops to be sent wherever in the world, not only in Africa, though it happened mostly in Africa, on his own decision. Now, thanks to a change in the constitution that was actually proposed by Nicolas Sarkozy, so after 3 months, the French president has to provide some justification at the parliament. If you look at Germany, for instance, whenever they try to send soldiers, they send a few hundreds in Mali, they have to go to the parliament. Whether it's under the national flag, or in the European or UN operation. This is not the case in France, and of course France is using that to still prove that France is a relevant, I wouldn't say superpower, but power, this ability justify its permanent seat at the Security Council.
Is France feeling any competition in Africa with China, US, and another international power, in economic sense, I mean?
Yeah, of course. Competition start, you could certainly describe the first 2 decades in Africa as a situation where the Cold War froze basically international allegiances of new African states. The way France cultivated the relation with its former colony meant that he had the upper hand on a number of key economic sectors. Now, that was true up to the early 1980. Now we are in 2018, so which means that change occurred. As I say, France is, for instance, present in Angola or in Nigeria or in Kenya, which are not French colonies. So French companies had to prove that they were good enough to compete. But on the same side, what we see in Ivory Coast, for instance, we see Chinese company doing very well. And maybe we see Dubai World taking over some ports in areas where France would have pretended a kind of de facto monopoly and so on. So there is competition. Africa is much more open to globalization than many people believe. And of course, African states need money, need support, need alliances. And that's why you can't say that, I doubt it was true, but you can't say today that France still has a monopoly anywhere in Africa, and that's better.
Dr. Marshall, I mean, why, according to a lot of Pan-Africanists and African intellectuals, why France is so reluctant to offer an apology for its colonial time in Africa?
You know, the question is, is what is, there is, for instance, a difficulty to express views on what has been happening in a number of historical situations. Okay, any country faces this problem. We could, I won't quote the history of Sudan, the recent history of Sudan, but we could quote what happened in Turkey. We could talk what happened throughout the Second World War. We have this problem between Japan, China, and South Korea. So the question is how to get a public debate and public education so that those kind of behaviors do not happen again. France first when we say France is who exactly? The French society, the academic institution, my universities among so many others. We have researchers that publish books on the history of Algeria, or as well as the history of the Second World War, because nothing was, nothing was so
But
clear.
leave the politician aside. Even from the intellectual, and elites of France, they couldn't open debate on that.
No, there is. If we talk especially Africa, I would refer you to the work of Georges Ballandier.
Yes.
Okay, Georges Ballandier has been our father. All those who are studying African societies, whether ethnologists, anthropologists, sociologists, or political scientists, they all will refer to Ballandier. Ballandier has written extensively on this problem. At the colonial time, opposing and explaining. We have Frantz Fanon on a different stance did it as well. So I do not believe that the situation is as black and white as you describe it. There is a debate in the French society. There are many publications, there are many opportunities by which this question is raised and raised again. We had, as you may remember, in 2005 we have huge demonstrations in the popular outskirts of Paris, and there was a debate why actually those places were mostly populated by people, by young people who were coming from former African colonies. Was it a kind of post-colonial upheaval, or was it something more linked to the internal inequality structure of the French society? So this is debated. The question of apologies is okay, we start, and then what? Who is going to, and you may remember this conference about slavery in South Africa, who is going to apologize for slavery? Where do we start?
Even not through the reconciliation approach.
Yeah, and so what is important, and I think what is important is that people know their history.
Yes.
And do, it would be a kind of anachronism to use our mental or political categories of today to appreciate a situation that took place centuries ago. At the same time, it is important that people know their history, not their imaginated history, and because they have this knowledge, they do not repeat mistakes of the past.
Dr. Marshall, thank you for this answer. I think I would like to focus more in the region right now and in Africa in general. There is an introductory question when it comes to Africa about the conflict in Africa, the root causes of conflict in Africa. Scholars, they have pinpointed different factors from underdevelopment, lack of democracy, accountability, or and other factors. And people also look at the foreign intervention in general, what is the main causes of conflict in Africa in a descriptive way?
Again, I do believe the history of Sudan is not the history of Ethiopia. So if you want to analyze what is happening, what was happening in your country, you would have to look the specificities, how your country plays within the region, its connection with the outside world, international interest or regional interest, as well as the internal tensions, because there is always a tendency to look for foreign involvement and forget that actually the internal situation is not fair. It's not fair for a great part of the population. Is what we are witnessing today in Ethiopia is people want more freedom. They want to be able to speak, to elect people who are not from a specific coalition. They feel that maybe if you have seen the same party ruling for too long, it's not good. It's better to have competition. It's what we have in
lack of democracy might be.
It's not only a lack of it's a lack of democracy. It's as well a will of change, which is not exactly the same, and so we have those specificities that I believe are very important. So I do not believe that it would be when I listen often my colleagues saying the root causes of conflicts. Yes, you have root causes. But at the same time, the fact that the conflict breaks out and is unfold for years, sometimes for decades, create as well a new situation, and is what we have been witnessing in South Sudan. To a large extent, what has been happening over the last year is more the consequences of a certain political dynamics throughout the war.
The tribal politics is
it's not only tribal politics, I may differ with you, than only the root causes that started, let us say, at the colonial time.
As a political scientist and a scholar and well aware of the situation of Sudan, did you expect the separation of South Sudan in 2011?
I think, to tell you the truth, I was here actually, I was visiting your country quite often in the 2000s. I had a hope, and many of my colleagues disagreed with me. I had a hope that CPA in January 2005 would offer really different alternatives.
Opportunity, a window of hope.
Yeah, window, and maybe a way to, I wouldn't say it was impossible to reset the relations between what is called North and South. We could as well discuss those two categories, what they mean actually. But certainly there was an hope that the relations could end up in another way. Now, if you were looking at the situation from South Sudan, I think it was nearly impossible. Most of my colleagues who were working on South Sudan and be there said that even if some parts of the population weren't aware of what means independence, in legal terms and so on, most of them wanted their own state against the North. And therefore for them it was obvious that the independence of South Sudan was on the only item on the agenda. Being in Khartoum, looking at the way the leadership of SPLA was socializing, I thought you missed opportunities, and I will certainly believe that the government in Khartoum could have done much better to avoid that. I saw changes in the business realm, how your business people suddenly became much more interested in South Sudan, wanted to have deals, and that's exactly what you needed. Sometimes civil society is not only NGOs talking about women's rights and human rights and so on, is as well the private sector, and the private sector had the potential to connect these two parts of the former Sudan, and maybe bring to the agenda different, let us say, different thoughts that weren't part of the public debate at that time. It did not happen. That's history. And South Sudan does exist. Sudan exists. You're still a great country. You still have to be. You still can be ambitious about your future. Let us see what happens. You know, brothers could be different and still be part of the same family.
Would like to talk a little bit about the Horn of Africa. The current situation of Horn of Africa those days might be have some sort of concern. And how do you describe in general the situation in Horn of Africa right now? Then we come to details after that.
You know, when I started my career as a very young researcher, we were at the end of the Cold War. So EPLF was fighting, taking over, or trying to take over Massawa. And then we had this drastic change by the end of the 1980s. You had Enras came here as well. We had the Ethiopian regime collapsed. Then we had the new coalition led by Meles Zenawi, and the independence of Eritrea. So it was a moment by which say, okay, the map has been reframed, though the war in South Sudan was still on. But there was an expectation that this part of the African continent will get stability, as it happened actually in southern Africa. It took a few more years, but then we had election '94. We had the end of the apartheid state in South Africa. We had the elections in Mozambique, the end of the war between Frelimo and Renamo, I would say we had, as we had in the Horn, one conflict that actually stayed for quite some time. In Southern Africa, that was the Angolan War, that stayed up to 2002. In the Horn, we had the Somali crisis. That was a civil war, then changed into a kind of recurrent instability, but manageable. I think what has changed is two aspects. The first one is the fact that we had new regimes at that time that could have brought a sense of stability, but those regimes in the Horn, including in your country, I think did not really respond to expectations from the population. So you had a number of situations where the regimes became more coercive. Look what happened in Ethiopia after the elections in 2005. You had, not to talk about your own country, you had this problem on one side. On the other side, I think we had global dynamics played a greater role. Maybe because being busy with internal coercion, the states hadn't any real model to offer. We see in Europe how globalization has brought actually new forces which are not exactly pro-globalization, like the extreme right-wing parties, racist organization, and so on. I think in the same way, we had new organization on a very different political setting. And that's how the country I studied the most, Somalia, we saw the emergence of new Islamic trends, more violent.
I know that you are a specialist in Somalia. You have done extensive work and publication in Somalia. Just one question, Somalia, before we go to break. In Somalia, you have a Shabab problem, and I saw that you talk about it before. The question that Somalia is the most harmonious African country in terms of religion, tribe and ethnic,
yeah.
and most of the people think why having this conflict in a very social, harmonious country like Somalia, and with negative contribution from terrorist organization like Shabab.
No, I believe this is maybe why sometimes we fail as political scientists. This is one country, one tribe, one religion, one nation. As it was said in a quite actually wonderful book written in the late 1980s, is actually wrong. When you know better the Somali society, you will see that actually Islam is not homogeneous. You have, and for quite some time, it started before the Civil War. You had, of course, a great influence of Sufi organizations. You had already Wahhabi or Salafi trends organized, present in the big cities, in the north, as well as in the capital city in Mogadishu. You had as well Shia. Were present there are a few mosques in Mogadishu, in Merka, in Brava. And the way people actually refer to those organizations, to those trends, were different. At that time, I'm talking about the late 1980s, but we could go back to history. I'm ready to do that for you.
No, let us continue on that.
The Sufi orders were basically quietist and endorsing a state that was perceived by most of the youth, a great part of the population, as oppressive. So they lost ground at first, not so much because, let us say, the understanding of religion became different, but mostly because their social allegiance to a power that wasn't liked by most of the population. Those things changed. You had the influence of the Gulf, that became very significant after the international intervention in December 1992 that reframed things. So on one side, as you say, is one religion. Yes, is one religion. Of course, is one religion is Islam, and there wasn't any contest of that. But the way, the understanding of what Islam means for the social life, for the political life, was very different and became extremely different throughout the first decade of the Civil War. Now, when you look now the tribe, what it says, they are all Somalis. Now, actually, you have to be extremely...
less than 1 minute just to finish this.
You have to be extremely aware. Somalia, first you have many other groups. You have Bantus, who are extremely numerous but not counted. You have what they call Gibelat, which means people with white skin like mine, and who are actually people coming from Yemen or South Iran and so on. Those people, they play an important economic role. You had Indians as well. And then among the Somalis, you had kind of hierarchies that you could find in some groups in Eritrea as well, where if you are from that clan or subclan, it's good but not so good. So please, I don't want to marry your daughter, or you, and I won't allow my son or my daughter to be married by your son, and so on. So you have a lot of, maybe discrimination sometimes is too heavy word, but certainly differences that makes this society much more heterogeneous than we believe.
Can we continue after the break? أعزائي المشاهدين فاصل قصير ثم نعود فابقوا معنا. مرحبا بكم أعزائي المشاهدين مرة أخرى، ونحن نواصل الحوار مع دكتور مارشال، اختصاصي الشؤون الإفريقية والسياسة الأفريقية في المعهد القومي للأبحاث العلمية في باريس. نستضيفه اليوم لمناقشة تطورات السياسة الأفريقية والعلاقة الفرنسية الأفريقية وأيضا التطورات في القرن الأفريقي. دكتور مارشال, why there is no African Spring as it was happened in the Arab world? What is the difference?
First, I believe Africans were better, came earlier. We should remember that in the early 1990s, there was a wave of protests throughout Africa. And I'm talking especially about sub-Saharan Africa, that basically, provoke drastic changes in the political system. Multi-party came up. Multi-party system was accepted. Human rights became an issue. Freedom of the media, freedom of speech was installed. And this was much earlier than what happened in Tunisia.
So Africa in general was way ahead of the
There was no. What I'm, is again because I'm an academic. I intend to compare with previous area. Let us remember the end of the Second World War. In Latin America, if you look at that period, it was something extraordinary. For the first time, you know, though those countries were managed with a heavy hand by military dictatorship, suddenly you had a wave of democratization. And countries that are known up to that time either, you know, near to fascist regime or really dictatorial regime, suddenly became democratic. Now, it didn't last for long because democracy is a daily fight everywhere in the world, not only in Africa, as well in Europe. We see that on many attempts of the state to restrict freedom of speech or to not respect the rights of citizens. But of course, it provided a political experience that helped mature people. Now, of course, what we have seen in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is we had this moment of democratization, and then we had, after the mid-1990s, a kind of restoration of the old, talking generally beyond the Horn of Africa. And now, what I do expect, on this restoration of the old authoritarian regime was identical to what existed previously. Still, we have free media, or not so free, but still media that has a capability to express itself. Still, we have NGOs supporting or promoting human rights and so on. And as well, we have a certain attention. We have elections that before were seen just as a waste of money. Now this is seen as necessary. So there is, I think we should pay attention to this trend, and as well understand that Africa today is 54 countries. These 54 countries, they are not the same. And so everyone will have his specific path of building a state, building its own understanding of democracy. It doesn't mean that we have to be silent on what's
Dr. Márshal, I mean, let us focus more on Horn of Africa. I have a question of dual dimension. First, about the Red Sea, security of the Red Sea. It becomes like a militarized zone, more than 7 to 8 military bases from outside the region. In Djibouti alone, we have like 3, 4. In Somalia, in Eritrea. Do you think this will endanger the regional security and spill over, I mean, other crises in other regions of the world, and bring it back to the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa?
Let us be clear, I don't see the fact that a foreign power has a military base in any country as a sign of stability. So that's why as you asked the question at first, I don't see French military bases on the African continent as a sign of good wealth, of the good health of the African states,
yes,
and as well as the kind of the best policy of my own state. I think we should, at one point, maturity, independence mean that military means should be at home, yes, and protect home. Now, this is what I would like. Now, the real world is slightly different. I do believe that, yes, there is a trend, as you describe it, to let us say, build a new military bases on the Red Sea. Now, it's not exactly new. It happened under the Cold War. It was restrained by the Cold War. So now we have to see whether we could find... Now, it happened under the Cold War, and what we have to see is whether the end of the Yemen war will actually change the parameters. Because still, when we see the statements made by a number of states ready to project forces on Red Sea, we don't know yet whether they do that because of the Yemeni war, the war in Yemen, or whether they do that because they have a specific interest in controlling, maybe securing, to be positive, the Red Sea. So this is one question. The second question, I believe, is this has to do with the fact that China is becoming the first global economic power, that China needs the Silk Road, and the Silk Road are actually through land as well as by sea. And of course, in this sense, the Red Sea is going to be a strategic channel. So,
but there is a concern that the Gulf crisis might spill over.
Of course, it's a genuine concern, and I share it as well. But what I'm telling you is, and this is my third point, is so there is a new economic interest. And the problem we have today is the regional organization that were supposed to handle those kind of issues, the Gulf Cooperation Council as well as IGAD for the Horn of Africa, are not in a situation to do that. For basically two reasons. They are deeply divided. IGAD is, let us say, seen by some analysts as just the expression of Ethiopian interests, so the others keep quiet under IGAD and do their own business. So it's not working properly as a regional organization. On the other side, IGAD doesn't include Egypt. So it's very difficult to do anything.
We are coming to that.
It's very difficult to find a collective security arrangement excluding a number of powers, Egypt, because it has never been part of IGAD, as well as Eritrea.
But there is no good reason for Egypt to be part of IGAD, geographically.
I'm not arguing about that. I'm just saying the situation is, the tendency, as I was told in one of my conferences here, the tendency is to look back the current existing organization. My point is those organizations, they are not fit for addressing this problem. As I said, first because they are deeply divided. Second, because the Gulf, as we know, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar do, on different stances, do not play with the others. On the other side, those organizations do not include some key players. So therefore, you can't just have a security arrangement without all stakeholders. That's why I used to say that if you want to move ahead, you will have to think about a new forum.
New regional order, you mean?
A new general one that could link the two spaces. And personally, I take the proposal I heard in one conference that was interesting. You know, I said, look what the OSCE is doing, the Organization for the Security and Cooperation within Europe is doing. And this is exactly the kind of model you could use. But the first thing you have to make clear to everyone, members of this region, is who is going to be, what state is going to be included, what state is not going to be included. And that certainly will raise difficult questions, because is Turkey going to be part of that deal? Because Turkey plays an important role in the Horn of Africa. Is Iran, though a bit far away, going to be a part of the deal? Again, this is not an easy question to answer. And then as well, I have to remind you, I'm an academic. I'm not the politicians or the diplomat like you who are going to frame the solution.
Okay, I mean, let us talk about the Nile water, because this is like one that is cross-border between North Africa and the Horn of Africa. 85% of the Nile water comes from Lake Tan in Ethiopia. Ethiopia right now claiming that it has the right to use water because it's not part of 1959 agreement between Sudan and Egypt that decided to share the water of the Nile on bilateral basis without having Ethiopia on that deal. And there is a conflict, we are following that. From geopolitics point of view, do you think Ethiopia has a right to use water in its national territory, that building the dam, and to take the concern of the others together, or we are open to water conflict in the region?
I think this region is suffering already from so many conflicts that there is an urgency to avoid a new one. the first thing. So which means let us sit, talk, argue, disagree, maybe exhaust ourselves in silly discussions, but let us not start a war, because one thing is to start a war, another thing is to end it. And it's very difficult to end those kind of
You
war.
cannot control the war.
Okay, the first thing. The second thing is, as you say, it's a collective good. So therefore, the management of this good has to go through a collective organization. This is largely the case because all riverine countries have this say. If it's not enough, and I believe that there have already been different attempts to do that, there could be further steps in the negotiation, find new ways to, let us say, aggregate conflicting interests in order to find a decent solution for Ethiopia, because Ethiopia needs...
But you're calling for cooperation and dialogue.
Everyone has his nice speech. Everyone has his debatable practices. Okay, Ethiopia as well as Egypt. So the question you will have, and personally, my personal understanding, which has no value because I speak only on my behalf and do not represent anybody except myself, is I personally do not see why in this discussion only Egypt and Ethiopia should be the interlocutors. Sudan is very much a country that will benefit or will pay a price for what is happening. Therefore, you have to be as well associated to the discussion on an equal footing. And I believe other riverine states as well have to discuss. South Sudan has to, despite the current crisis there, and despite maybe the lack of expertise there, but as a state they have to be part as well.
It's trilateral. It's trilateral.
Yeah, I'm just trying to say that if it's a collective
good,
what I'm trying to say, sir,
does Ethiopia has a right to use its water and it is national
not unilaterally. Not like in any countries in the world. We have many other situations where you need a collective agreement, and therefore there should be a collective agreement. But I'm absolutely supportive of the fact that Ethiopia is absolutely right, pushing his own national agenda on putting that on the table, because to a large extent they may have very good reasons to believe that the status quo is not.
But the Egyptian point of view that to stick to 1959 agreement between Sudan and Egypt and to ignore Ethiopia totally.
That's why you need people to sit and talk. You shouldn't, all my career is looking at conflicts, and the first thing when you try to look at conflict is to acknowledge that people fight for reasons they believe are good enough. So you can't just dismiss those reasons. So
okay, I got that. Another question regarding the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the territorial dispute. Do you think we can have a stable region in the Horn of Africa without solving this? There is a funny description, this like, two bald men, fighting over a comp.
Well, the international community, especially the US, promised that they will guarantee the full implementation of the Algiers Accord signed in December 2000. Now, what we have been witnessing is not exactly true. So certainly Eritrea got a point. Now, the second aspect is we know very well that the problem between Eritrea and Ethiopia is not exactly the
territorial dispute.
The territorial dispute.
Correct.
And therefore, it will be.
What is the reason?
Well, there are many, and certainly linked again to what has been happening in the 1980s more than what has been happening historically. What we see as well is how Eritrea used this conflict to still be a very important regional player. sometimes called spoiler by some, sometimes called as the reminder that this regional order is not fair by others. But certainly what we have to take into account is, again, the Eritrea as such. If you, I remember I was in Eritrea just after the 91, 92, 93, and you had so great expectations about the future. And then when I went back in Eritrea 15 years after, I saw Asmara as a sleepy capital city with the youth, fearing to get involved, recruit and so on. Again, it's not a political analysis, but what you see is really a young country has to respond to the hopes of its population and the youth. It's not the case today. It's not the case now. They could blame whoever they want. It's not the case, and that has to be changed. Ethiopia, there is a tendency in Ethiopia to believe, and we witness that these days, that whenever we face a political crisis, we could, use the button of nationalism, so pan-Ethiopianism, to suddenly remobilize the patriotism of this population against whatever near foreign enemy.
Is there any fear that, in terms of fighting terrorism, in the region full of, terrorist organization, we have a Shabab, Boko Haram, and ISIS in Libya, for example. There is a fear that these three or more than this terrorist organization might come together in the region, and that would be a real threat for the whole region. Do you think this is a right analysis or just exaggeration?
No, I believe it's more than an exaggeration. It's very wrong. When you look those organizations, you have different ways to look at them. Personally, I'm a political scientist, but my training has been in sociology. So what I see how Shabab is so different of Boko Haram. And I
so
guess
different from ISIS.
And from Daesh, Daesh is as well something very different, whether you look at it in Syria, Iraq, and the story in Iraq is very different of what has been happening in Syria. And if you look in Libya, again, it's very different now. Of course, you have people, moving from one place to the other. You may have with time some kind of homogenization process, but let us say socially, their dynamism, their roots in the society is very different. Now, the mistake made by the West has been to assess those organizations linked to their affiliation to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. What I'm telling you is, if you want to understand the dynamics of those organizations, if you want to understand why, despite beating them so often and so strongly, they still have this resilience, you will have to look for the social and political history of the places they are operating. We know very well that ISIS has a future in Iraq up to the time the Iraqi regime won't have solved the problem of its Sunni minority. Period. Now we could claim victory every 6 months, as the Americans are doing, or the French, it's not going to solve the problem. The same in Somalia. Why Shabab has been so able to exist and survive throughout all defeats is not only because Ethiopia made blunders, it's because basically a kind of social order that has been created by the civil war hasn't been challenged by the new government. They don't care about the people. They care about the government building the state, maybe buying some wonderful houses here and there in the world. But certainly you see that the current government has done very little, as the previous one, to
reconcile. Because the time might be limited right now. As a fresh intellectual, do you regret your country intervention in toppling Gaddafi, having the current situation right now? Because France was spearheading the international effort to topple Gaddafi. Comparing what happened right now.
Well, people will read my articles will know that I'm not an admirer of Idriss Deby, And at that time, actually, when I had the opportunity to talk to the media, I said that intervening in Libya was one of the major blunders because people misunderstood the importance of Libya towards the stability of Sahel and as well the existence of the African Union, because basically it was the only state in Africa paying at the end of the month the bills that some states didn't want to pay or couldn't pay. Now the French, Nicolas Sarkozy, decided to move the way he did in competition largely with David Cameron in UK. Obama decided to lead from behind. That's where the expression came from. And we got the mess. Yes, so I tell you, not only I do not regret, I oppose it. Like many of my colleagues, again, I'm not alone, many of my colleagues in France saw that the reasons for which the French and the Brits read in a very strange manner the UN resolution authorizing humanitarian intervention was very wrong, and that the consequences will actually harm populations first, as well as not offer any breakthrough to address the crisis that already was coming up in Mali, for instance.
My last question will be on Darfur and Chad. You have a paper or presentation, root of Darfur conflict and the Chadian conflict as well. Do you think any interlink of stability between Darfur and Chad in the current situation?
I think what we witnessed over the last 2 decades is how an agreement between N'Djamena and Khartoum could bring stability everywhere, and how a disagreement could bring war everywhere.
Correct.
Therefore, now the key issue, there are still 2 key issues, is, okay, what about the population in both regions? And I think the question mark is still on. And the second one is the sleeping partner in what has been happening in the 2000s was Libya. It didn't appear on the front, but it was actually extremely important to explain a number of military or political events on the ground, both in Sudan and Chad. So what's going to happen in Libya? And certainly this is a major issue that may see some development this year.
D.Rولان, Marshall, thank you very much for accepting to come to have this discussion. Is really fruitful. We are delighted to have you here, and we wish that if you have more time, because we have a couple of issues just to talk about in the region, taking advantage of your extensive knowledge of the region and your scientific background. Definitely, this is very important. You have said. أعزائي المشاهدين، لكم الشكر والتقدير على حسن المتابعة وحسن المشاهدة. وقد طوفنا مع د.رولان مارشال، اختصاصي العلوم السياسية في المعهد القومي للأبحاث العلمية في فرنسا، وأستاذ العلوم السياسية في الجامعات الفرنسية، على أن طوفنا على عدد من القضايا خاصة في المنطقة القرن الأفريقي، وكذلك حول علاقات فرنسا بأفريقيا، وقدم لنا إجابات كنا نتمنى أن يستمر الحوار، لكن للأسف انقضى الزمن المتاح لنا. لكم الشكر والتقدير على حسن المتابعة والمشاهدة. تقبلوا تحياتي وتحيات الفريق العامل، وإلى اللقاء في حلقة أخرى. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Thank you very much.